Hello, welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and thank you for joining us. I'm Helen Crowley, and you've probably met me in the previous webinars. I'm going to sort of moderate you through this webinar today. It's the 6th in our series on nature of fashion and the links between fashion and biodiversity. And today we're going to have a special focus on making an effective deforestation-free commitment. I'll get back into the agenda and the run of show in a little moment, but first over to Katie, who's going to give us sort of the nuts and bolts of how this is going to run today. Again, welcome. Stay tuned for a really insightful webinar. Thank you.
Hi everyone, welcome back. Thrilled to see many of you who have been here before and some new faces. Just as a friendly reminder, this is a go-to webinar. You should have a panel at the top of your screen. Go ahead and click the arrow to expand it. To ask a question during this presentation, simply type it in the chat box, and that will send it to me and our IT team who is on standby to help answer any questions and also troubleshoot any IT issues you may have. Another option is there is a hand button. You can go ahead and click that, which will indicate to us that your hand is raised. As a friendly reminder, this webinar is being recorded for distribution to the Fashion Pact. And with that, I'll go ahead and give it back over to you, Helen.
Thank you, Katie. Hello, everyone. So today, as I mentioned, we're doing, and you know, we're doing a webinar on deforestation free commitment, which is such a critical part of any biodiversity commitment and action. And as a leading group of companies that have pledged to do biodiversity strategies to implement science-based targets, looking at deforestation risk impact in your supply chains and figuring out how to do something about it is actually a critical part of that overarching approach to biodiversity and of course to climate. There's a huge overlap with climate. So what we wanted to do is sort of do a deep dive. It's on this issue, particularly because it's one of your specific commitments and that you are being public about in your outcomes and what you want to achieve by way of deforestation-free supply chain. So we're going to have a deep dive into that, and I'll come back and tell you a little bit more about the overarching sort of approach that we want to do during this webinar. But firstly, we thought we'd just launch with a little film that CI has done about what is biodiversity, just to sort of get us back into sort of the thinking of the framing of biodiversity, why it's important, why forests is such an important element of biodiversity, just to sort of get us back into sort of reflecting on the importance of nature and all that you're doing to really restore, protect and regenerate nature in your commitments. So Katie, if you'd like to launch the film, that would be great. Thanks. Enjoy, everybody.
1 million plant and animal species are at risk of extinction. The problem is, without this biodiversity, humans are in trouble. Biodiversity is the term used to describe the variety of all life on Earth. Earth's species, their characteristics, even their habitats, are what maintain the health and resilience of nature. The more biodiversity, the more secure all life is, including ours.
Biodiversity is the foundation of all the life on Earth. So we need biodiversity in the form of pollinators to keep our crops growing and to produce the food that we need. We need biodiversity to produce all the medicines that we are needing. And we need biodiversity to keep healthy ecosystems to sequester the carbon that we need to combat climate change.
In the last 50 years, humans have wiped out 68% of animal populations. Experts say that the planet is undergoing its 6th mass extinction.
Biggest die-off of life on Earth since the giant meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs?
If that doesn't scare you, consider this. biodiversity provides everything humanity needs for free. If we were to put a number on it, the value of goods and services provided by biodiversity is estimated to amount to $125 trillion per year. That's more than 2/3 of global GDP. The continued loss of biodiversity affects the food we eat, the water we drink, to say nothing of our economy. Floods, fires, disease outbreaks all have connections to biodiversity loss.
Why can't we stop this?
As long as we disturb wild animals and our ecosystems, these viruses will continue jumping into us and causing trouble.
Conservationists say that protecting at least 30% of land and 30% of sea on Earth by 2030 is critical for stopping and reversing the loss of species around the globe.
The good news is that there's a whole suite of tools that we can implement. It's not just about creating national parks and protected areas, although that is important. It's also about integrating the economic value of everything nature gives us into all of our decisions. And it's about partnering with local and indigenous communities. Up to 80% of all plant and animal species and 17% of carbon stored in the world's forests is on indigenous lands. So it's essential that the lands and rights of indigenous people are recognized if we want to save the planet and all of us that call it home.
There is hope. We've seen humpback whales recover thanks to an international conservation agreement. We've seen giant pandas recover thanks to restoration of bamboo forests. And we've seen gray wolves recover thanks to federal protections in the US. We know nature has an astonishing capacity to rebound, but avoiding future loss of biodiversity isn't enough. We all need to give nature the chance it needs to recover, for humanity's sake.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks. That was lovely. I always get a little teary when I see these images of nature, but it has a really terrific message at the end about the resilience if we allow nature to recover. And as you notice through that film, a lot of the imagery, when they talk about destruction of nature, biodiversity loss, is about deforestation. You can see, where they show the sort of the expanding agricultural frontier or the expanding urban frontier into forest landscapes. So it is an important part of what we look at is how do we stop that expanding frontier into natural ecosystems, particularly forests, which are important for Indigenous people, for us, for all of the ecosystem services globally, for so many reasons. And how do we prioritize our action around this topic of stopping deforestation and then allowing and in supporting restoration and regeneration of forest ecosystems as well as other types of natural ecosystems. So today we're going to focus on forest, and we're really lucky to have 3 experts with us who are going to give some different perspectives on the deforestation commitments that have been made over the last few years. What we've got now, you have actually, the Fashion Pact companies have this great point in time where you can learn from 20+ years experience and proving out in the field of what does it take to really put in place a deforestation-free commitment. What does it really take for companies with long and diffuse supply chains to really support deforestation free action and to encourage better policy, to encourage better protection of forests? How do you do that? And we've got 2 experts who are first going to talk about that, and then we've got John Buchanan of Conservation International, who's had over 20 years experience in commodity supply chains and this whole issue all around the world, and Pretra Tanos of the Tropical Forest Alliance, which is actually a tremendous multi-stakeholder platform that mobilizes private sector action around this issue of commodity-driven deforestation, and it's housed at the World Economic Forum. So you've got 2 really terrific experts here who are going to give you their perspectives on the sort of the context for deforestation free commitments, a bit of the history, what we can learn from that, and how we move forward and sort of leapfrog some of the mistakes that were done in the past and move in a very sort of rapid and effective way on collective action for deforestation. That you are in this brilliant position as a group of companies with this commitment. You are in a position to really lead, particularly the fashion sector, on this critically important endeavor. And we also have a guest, Agathe Grossmith, from Carrefour, who's going to give her perspective as a Fashion Pact company member, but also as a company that's been working on this topic for a long time, and give us sort of a company perspective on this context and issue around deforestation-free supply chain. So with that, I'm very happy to introduce John, who will set some context for us on this issue. Thank you, John.
Great. Thank you, Helen, and thanks to all of those joining us today. And of course, a big thanks to you, the members of the Fashion Pact, for the work you're doing and for really engaging on these critically important issues that are so essential for all of us and for future generations. So I wanted to set a bit of the context and to pick up a little bit where the video left off. And as Helen just said, you've made a biodiversity commitment, and we're talking about the importance of forests. And the reason for that is because forests are the home where so many of the world's species live. It's estimated that about 80% of all known terrestrial species live in the Earth's forest. And so the connection between biodiversity and deforestation is really critical, because loss of these species home through deforestation and habitat conversion is the #1 threat to biodiversity. Again, just to use as an example of the Amazon, 1 in every 10 known species is found in the Amazon forest. So this is where all the, so many of our rare and unique species around the world live, and really important, not just for the critters and the animals out there and the plants and animals, but also for us. As we heard in that video, people depend on healthy forests around the world. We all depend on forests for the clean air and the fresh water that they provide to us every day. And we wouldn't be here without forests and without that critical role that they play in filtering air and water and buffering us from storms. And those connections can be very direct in some places of the world. And in particular, while we depend on forests for clean air and a stable climate, there are almost 2 billion people around the world that depend on it for their daily lives. This is a matter of survival for so many people around the world who depend on forests for sources of food, for sources of income, for building materials, for medicines. And so this is really a critical issue for them, and so important in times of crisis like we face now. We see it time and time again when there's a devastation from a tsunami or a hurricane or market shocks or things like now, like the pandemic, that for poor people around the world, especially the rural poor, who don't have some of the safety nets that we're blessed to have, they need to depend on nature, and they often turn to nature for sources of emergency food or sources of income, that kind of last resort. And we're seeing that happen now. People looking to not only forests but also to the oceans and for fish and other sources of food and income. And so again, really important and critical for people around the world. And of course, the challenge that we face, as we heard before, is that we're continuing to lose forests at an alarming rate, and roughly between 10 and 13 million hectares of forest a year are lost. And that's an area about the size of Greece. So this is a huge area that we continue to lose. It's converted to agriculture, infrastructure, urban areas, and so forth. And so an enormous challenge, not only for biodiversity, but next slide, Katie. but there's, and the major drivers of deforestation are agriculture. And we know that around the world, agriculture is a driver of roughly 73% of global deforestation. And here we see an image of, a large-scale farm, and we know that it's a mix. It's large-scale agriculture, commercial, industrial agriculture, but it's also small-scale agriculture, and that varies a bit between different regions of the world, but overall agriculture is the main challenge. And if we dig a bit deeper, we know that there's 4 key sectors that account for a substantial part of agricultural driven deforestation. Roughly 50% is a result of cultivation of palm oil, soy, beef, and pulp and paper plantation timber operations. And so these have been an area of focus and continue to be extremely important. And of course, for your sector, there's direct links to the beef supply chain for your leather, but also to timber for the connection to the viscose industry. But also important to recognize that if your company produces fragrances or personal care products, you also very likely have a link to the palm oil sector as well, because palm oil is an ingredient that is so versatile and is converted into so many different oleochemical ingredients and products that you probably have it in your personal care or your perfume products. And important to note, these are some snippets from a report that came out from Global Canopy quite recently. The world is taking note of the fashion sector's impact on deforestation and forest clearing as well. And so again, important to continue to get our arms around this and get ahead of this challenge. And of course, loss of forest is not only important and a problem for biodiversity, but also for climate change. And the conversion of forests and the loss of forests is the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's second only to burning of fossil fuels. So this is a critical issue in the fight against climate change. Next slide, Katie. And it's so important that we know we cannot achieve the Paris Climate Agreement targets without dealing with deforestation and sustainable land management. Nature represents 30% of the climate change solution we need to keep climate change to a manageable level, to keep under 3 degrees, to hit the Paris targets. So what's really important here is that if we only focus on decarbonization, if we only focus on conversion to renewable energies and energy efficiency and the like, and if we were wildly successful, we did that tomorrow, but we don't deal with deforestation in nature, we cannot hit the Paris targets. That's a really important factor. It's not an either or, it's both. We must decarbonize, but we also need to figure out how to stop deforestation and how to conserve nature. And that's in part because as we've seen, when we lose forests, and the burning and destruction of forests, that releases greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that's about half of this 30%. But the other half of the 30% is by regrowing and restoring forests, they can actually take carbon out of the atmosphere. And so together, that's a really critical part of the solution. And what's really important as well is that nature as a solution to climate change, it's immediate, it's effective, it's a known technology. Trees are nature's technology. And so it's one of the most cost-effective solutions we have for climate change today. But the challenge is that if we compare the importance of nature as a solution and look at how much investment it receives, it's still just a tiny fraction of the overall investment in climate funding. And so really important that we figure out how to give nature a greater prominence as a solution and an investment option in dealing with climate change. So Katie, I think I'd turn it to you now for the first question.
Great, thank you, John. So we have our first full polling question that I'm going to go ahead and launch on the screen. So we just kind of want to know a little bit more about where you and your company are at on forest and biodiversity or deforestation commitments. So it's a select one option. I've gone ahead and launched it on the screen. If you could go ahead and select one, we'll give it a few moments. So the options are, yes, we have a policy related to forest and deforestation. Yes, we have a policy related to biodiversity. Yes, we have policies related to both forest and biodiversity. And no, we do not have a policies addressing either, or if you're not sure. So this will give us a little bit more of an understanding of where you guys are at in these commitments and where we need to go to deliver on that action item number 2 under the Fashion Pact. So we'll give it a few more seconds. Great. I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll and share it. So this is really interesting, you know, so it looks like it's great to see that it's even, right? We have, a lot of you do have a policy related to forest and deforestation, and then there's quite a few of you that don't. So clearly we've got some work to do, and this is a great opportunity for us to get back into the session. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn it back over to you, John.
Great. And so I just want to say just a few words about kind of the history of efforts to deal with deforestation and commodity supply chains. Next slide, please, Katie. Because it's certainly not a new issue, and it first started to get widespread public attention back in the 1980s and 90s, and it was mostly around beef and the association between beef and deforestation and connection to supply chains and companies like McDonald's. And in those early days back in the 80s, I think a lot of companies dealt with it simply by trying to understand where their suppliers were operating and establishing that they weren't in the areas where those things were happening. And that was kind of a sufficient solution at the time. And of course, it wasn't. That's not a solution. And as awareness and attention of the issue grew, there's been more investigation and kind of research into the causes of deforestation, connections made to other commodities, and as the ones I mentioned before. We saw a lot more campaigning and advocacy work by some of the campaigning organizations such as Greenpeace, who have raised attention of the issue, but importantly as well, the scientific community has demonstrated that this is real, it's happening, and this is a problem that needs to be dealt with. And so I think that's important, that that validation that these are critical issues that need to be dealt with are associated with these challenges, the problem of deforestation. And so next slide, Katie. So leading companies got engaged and started taking action on the issue. And I think in the early days, in the 90s, a lot of these efforts tended to focus on education and understanding what are the problems, how does it relate to our supply chains or our suppliers. Next, Katie. Engaging that discussion with kind of members of the supply chain. Developing certification programs as well was an early big focus in the early days, with the Forest Stewardship Council launched in I think it was 1993. Then you had to deal with pulp and paper and timber sectors, and then in 2004 was the launch of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, again to develop standards and an approach to dealing with sustainability and deforestation within those specific sectors. And a lot of efforts as well in the early leaders in the 90s and early 2000s to understand origins of supply chains. Products and commodities like palm oil tend to be pretty opaque supply chains, and so a lot of effort's been made to understand where is it coming from. Companies investing in understanding where their suppliers are operating to be able to better deal with the problem and the challenges. Next, Katie. And you can hit the next button as well. And a lot of the effort, as I alluded to, was developing these standards and certification approaches. And a lot of this was based on kind of a top-down or market-based approach, and the assumption that if companies that are major buyers of these commodities, and if they put the right standards in place, put the right requirements for their direct suppliers, that those incentives and that kind of market leverage would drive transformation of the industry, create incentives maybe through price premiums or maybe through market access, and that would drive transformation of the industry. And I'll turn it over to Petra to talk about kind of where that's gotten us.
Great, thanks so much, John, and hi everyone, great to be here today. So I'll pick up a little bit where John left off to say, as John described, there was a significant movement to take action on behalf of the private sector, and there has been progress made. But the numbers tell, I think, a more nuanced story. So first, what we do know is commitments have absolutely grown. So well over 500 companies have made commitments to zero deforestation supply chains. But again, the story is a bit more nuanced. What we also know is that when it comes to implementation of these commitments, about half of these companies that have got commitments are not really telling the story of what they're doing about implementing them. So there's no real reporting on progress. The commitment is there, but we don't know what's happening. We don't know if it's really being implemented. And when then you start looking at what's happening at the level of land use, there has been an ongoing increase in primary forest loss in the tropics. So 44% increase in annual forest loss in the years 2014 to 2018. So that starts to say, yes, the commitments have been made, but actually their impact on land use and on forests isn't being felt. And there are definitely some more alarming statistics. Every 6 seconds, a football pitch of primary forest is being lost. So if we think about what that means for this webinar alone, how many football pitches of forest are being cut down as we're presenting this to you, it's really a very alarming thing. The other thing I want to mention is that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has actually given us a timeline. If we can't improve the situation, if we can't get on a better path by 2030, we will have missed a window to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And then our job becomes actually adapting to those impacts. So what we've got right now is an opportunity to mitigate, but only if action is taken urgently. The one other thing I want to highlight here is that 2020 is a seminal year for forests. Many of you know that a large number of consumer goods companies, in particular in the food and beverage sector, made commitments to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains by the end of this year. And what we're seeing is that whilst absolutely progress has been made, there is a huge need for more action because very few companies have come even close to meeting that target. The really good news, I think, for the Fashion Pact, if you go to the next slide, Katie, is that we have learned a lot over the course of the last decade, and that gives us a lot to build on. And Katie, if you could just go ahead and get all those bullets on the screen, so I'll talk through them. I would say, from the perspective of a lot of the folks working on this, one of the biggest lessons is that commitment alone is not enough. There has to be emphasis on implementation. You've got to have clear milestones and targets and a regular review to check in on where you're making progress. And on top of this, we actually have learned a lot specifically about what works and what doesn't work on the ground. So, it's absolutely critical that incentives reach those that are closest to the forest, that a commitment that you make actually does translate into an incentive for behavior change to the people that are the stewards of the land. And then stopping deforestation is, that's not always the priority for the governments and in fact for people that are living and working in producing countries, right? So how do we, shift a narrative that's about forest protection, but also about protecting jobs, about creating future employment opportunities, that this agenda cannot be at odds with economic development. And that's also part of the reason why we've learned that solutions really need to be accessible to smallholder producers, and in fact producers of all sizes, but especially ones that are very kind of operating on a really small scale and feeding into these massive global supply chains. They're often disempowered, disenfranchised, and they need to be engaged, and the solutions need to be accessible to them. We've also learned that deforestation is actually not as, it's not as simple as, right, we've just got to stop chopping down the trees. There is a whole lot of underlying systemic issues, everything from poverty to, poor law enforcement, a weak regulatory and enforcement environment. So this is not an easy problem to solve. And we've also learned crucially that individual voluntary corporate action is not sufficient. What we have seen is companies have made commitments and they've been some of them really incredibly effective at actually implementing the commitments and making really great progress. But this then hasn't necessarily translated into change on the ground. So you're able to clean up your own supply chains, but that's not necessarily fixing the broader systemic problem. If you go to the next slide, Katie, we'll also see that over the last decade, we've come up with a lot of new solutions and innovations and ways to adapt to tackling this challenge. We know a lot more about what works. First, we've got absolutely massive numbers of tools and resources that help with traceability into supply chains. Satellite technology, Earth observation technology is being deployed in new ways every day that help us see actually how land use is changing on the ground. This wasn't available to us even a decade ago. We're able to understand risk, we're able to see supply chains, and so the implication is that it's easier to take action. It also means that there's a lot more visibility to what's going on the ground. Another thing that's really emerged is that there is a huge opportunity to take action beyond just your individual supply chains and to engage more proactively in key production areas for some of these commodities in what are called landscape and jurisdictional approaches, which really do offer practical solutions for businesses, even ones that are quite removed from origin, to be able to influence, shape, and support the way that commodities are being produced at their origin, at their source. Another crucial element is that engaging governments, communities, indigenous peoples, and other stakeholders, both in producing countries and in key demand markets, is necessary, right? Individual corporate action, again, really, really great, but you also need the regulatory environment on both sides of the supply chain to be really supportive of the commitments that are being made. And finally, what we've also seen is really an evolution of what the TFA calls collective action, which is how sort of corporates actually join forces to work together. And you can go to the next slide. In the kind of 2010s, progress was really driven by voluntary corporate commitments. So lots of emphasis on certification, lots of emphasis on on your individual supply chains. Very little interaction with government on these issues, not a lot of commitment to engaging on the policy level, very limited collaboration with NGOs and local stakeholders on the ground, to this kind of new decade that we've come into, where what we've seen is actually an emergence of of what TFA calls the coalitions of the willing, the coalitions of companies that are wanting to lead this agenda and are wanting to accelerate action together. And what this means is that you can deploy collective leverage to ensure not just that your individual supply chain is up to snuff, but actually that the whole supply base is being is working effectively. And effectively what you're doing is driving sector transformation instead of just addressing a problem as an individual company. And it also, this collective approach really also enables that engagement in key production landscapes that I mentioned earlier. That really is a key solution to this problem. And doing that alone is really overwhelming, difficult, and expensive. Doing that together has massive potential for impact. And I'm particularly thrilled to be on this call today because TFA works very closely with the Consumer Goods Forum, Forest Positive Coalition of Action, that launched during Climate Week just a couple of weeks ago. We're also supporting the Action for Sustainable Derivatives, which is a coalition working specifically for the personal care and cosmetics sector on palm oil. We also work closely with the Soft Commodities Forum, which is a coalition of some of the biggest commodities traders. These names will all be familiar to you. And it is just absolutely fantastic to see that 35% of the fashion and luxury goods sector has come together as the Fashion Pact to commit to really ambitious action, not just on biodiversity, but also on climate and ocean. So you're not alone in this. There are other sectors and other coalitions. And so this is just a huge opportunity to drive transformation. I'm actually now really thrilled to introduce Agatha Gross-Smith from Carrefour. As you know, Carrefour is a signatory of the Fashion Pact, but they're also leading the CGF, the Consumer Goods Forum Forest Positive Coalition of Action. So they've been working in this sort of a specific coalition dedicated to addressing commodity-driven deforestation for palm oil, soy, and pulp paper and packaging, and potentially other commodities. And so I would invite Aga to offer some of her own reflections on what working as a coalition has been like, and Carrefour's journey, and some potential opportunities for collaboration. So Aga, very happy to hand the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Petra. Hello, everyone. I hope you're well, and I'm delighted to be with you today, both as part of the Fashion Pact itself and also of the Forest Positive Coalition of CGF. I come here to join you very humbly, both because you're all CSR expert and leader in your field, but also because forest is one of the topics we feel very humble with, as the challenge is very big. So I just would like to share with you today some company feedback, company experience, and how we've been going through that journey that some of you have already taken from where we saw in the poll. Maybe the first question I need to answer is, why did we work on forest at the very beginning? You need to know maybe that in Carrefour's business, forests are actually quite present. Our activity is very connected to forest, even though it doesn't seem very obvious for our clients. But if you go in a Carrefour store, you will go in a hypermarket maybe, and you will see, let's say, some hygiene papers, for instance, that you may want to shop. You may also see some charcoal for your barbecue, and then in all the consumer goods area, you will see some products that are wrapped in pulp and cardboard. If you go a bit further, you will find some biscuits, maybe that contain palm oil. Or you can also buy eggs and beef that might be fed with soy that might come from areas connected with forest. And finally, if you shop in a Carrefour Brazil store, then you will definitely find some beef that could be raised in some areas close to forest. That's just to give you a bit of an overview, but it's important for you to know why you're working on this subject, and that it was an important thing for us to know that. I didn't mention viscose, but obviously it's also part of what we sell, and I could go on with cocoa and other commodities. So actually our activity is very much linked to forest. So we decided to work on forest, and we started with taking a commitment. That commitment was zero deforestation 2020, as you know that. And we've been implementing this commitment, working commodity by commodity. I think that was our starting point. Working a lot on tools like traceability, ensuring we know where our products are coming from, and checking if those areas are connected to potential forest link or for forest risk. We also used a lot certification. I think certification was one of the very big steps we took, and that helped us secure some of our supply chains. And finally, other tools like geomonitoring that we use for cattle in Brazil, and so on. So what is the result now? Well, as I think Petra expressed for the wider sector, but I can share this from Carrefour, I think we made major steps. If we didn't take that commitment in 2009, I think, we would never have reached where we are now. For instance, most of our palm oil will be coming from a secured supply chain by the end of the year. Nearly all our supplies now in Brazil are checked with a geomonitoring tool. So these steps are great, but the deforestation is still happening. That's the reality, with commodities that we use or that we are connected within our supply chain. So we can't do this alone. That's basically the answer we came up with. We can't do this alone. This is why we need a coalition that are ready to move with us. I'm just gonna go through the main value of what we see in this coalition. Of course, I'm talking about the Forest Positive Coalition, but I think it could be transposed with what you may do within the Fashion Pact. First of all, I think if we share together, we will learn more rapidly. We can share feedbacks from our experience, test and learn, and move further and move faster if we need to adjust what we are doing. I think when we work together, we are sending a very clear message to the market, so to our suppliers, but also beyond suppliers. So that's also a very important point. When one full sector like fashion is going in one direction, the market will be listening to that message. Then we can also set market-wide practices. So that's also very important for us, because you can see that even though we secure some of our supply chain, deforestation may still be happening elsewhere. And we can't say there's absolutely no connection in between those two. We need to make sure the practice we want to see are implemented very widely. This is why we need coalitions. We need to work together to ensure that. And the more we are, of course, the more this spreads across the markets. It's setting up a level playing field that is comfortable for you as a company, but it's also making sure it's actually efficient. And then one other point is it gives you an opportunity to leverage your influence beyond your direct suppliers. We know that sometimes your direct suppliers is not necessarily the best actor to deal with to fight deforestation. You may be speaking with a small farmer that, for instance, for beef or for soy, will not know exactly what to do. But if we work together, we can have actually a bigger impact and talk to bigger actors that are upstream, and potentially other stakeholders like states or NGOs or other stakeholders that we do need on board. That's, I think, the main points. I just want to mention one thing that is actually important for you as fashion industry. We are a group of companies within CGF is exploring whether we should work on cattle more specifically, and we believe there is an opportunity to do that together. So we have set up a working group to check exactly what added value we could have together, and starting with stating what are our expectations and how we can transmit this and assess this across our supply chain. I think there is a big opportunity to work together on this. So this is a call to all of you to join, actually, because we want this to be very open, and we have set up a way to work that is actually open for CGF and non-CGF members company to work with us. So this is still exploring states, but we want to move very fast. I think that's one of the important recommendation also, is to be action driven. Otherwise, you know that those collective platforms can take a lot of time, and I will not lie on this to you. It's demanding, but very clearly we can feel that when we work alone, we work clearly faster. That's an obvious thing. I will not tell you that we don't spend some time with a group of companies, but when we do it together, we go clearly a lot further. So that's what we can do together. So very happy to talk with you and go a bit further on the cattle challenge we share, even if we are in different businesses.
Great, thanks so much, Agathe. Really great to have some of that perspective from a company that's involved in this from a different sector perspective. So thank you, and I agree there's just massive opportunity when you're working as a collective. What I'd like to now do is just turn over to what, based on the experience of a lot of folks working in this space, would be a recommended process for the implementation of a commitment. This is quite high level and there's a lot of different steps, but we thought it would be really helpful to just set this context for you. So the first thing you really absolutely need to do is a strategic review. And in particular, what becomes important is the materiality assessment. So what are the deforestation and habitat conversion risks in your supply chains? And what are the particularly high risk materials? And then this also involves actually understanding where your supply chain touches high risk regions. So you might have a high risk raw material that's actually coming from a source that's not high risk. So it's really important to have both the what's high risk and where is it coming from as part of the strategic review process. And to be very clear about what problems or issues that you're trying to address in those places. Second, you've got to develop policies, targets, and commitments. And this, as I mentioned before, it is really important to have clear milestones and targets and a process that allows you to check, right, are you getting it done? Is the commitment that you said actually happening? What's your implementation plan? It's insufficient just to have the commitment. You've got to have the targets that you're trying to reach and the policies to enable those commitments to come to life. It's also really important to communicate these policies, targets, and commitments outside your organization. So this means to your suppliers, obviously, but to other key stakeholders, and also inside your organization, because one of the challenges that we hear most often from companies is that whilst certain units, divisions, or teams are really committed to the execution of this plan, it's not necessarily always well aligned with what the rest of the business is doing. So that internal buy-in and that internal engagement becomes absolutely critical. Then you've got to unlock that traceability and supply chain mapping that we've been talking about throughout today's presentation. Mapping supply chains, understanding who your tier 1 suppliers are, and then checking whether they're doing what you're asking of them is absolutely important. And eventually actually going beyond your tier 1 suppliers and engaging those further upstream. Then a risk assessment and prioritization needs to be put in place. So you've got to, kind of really determine the initial risks for your suppliers and carry out additional analyses to make sure that the suppliers that need to improve their practices are aware of that and that you're working with them in your supply base. And that engagement really becomes key here, right? So it's, there's lots of different approaches to this, but fundamentally, the objective should be both addressing risks in your individual supply chain, but also driving sector transformation. And that can only really be done if suppliers that are lagging behind are engaged in improving, right? So if you just delist companies, it makes it really hard to drive transformation. The reality is that for most of these commodities, especially the ones that truly are commodities, there's always a market for the products that are not sustainable. And so that's why it becomes critical to drive that sector transformation. So it's about the broader supply base, and engaging suppliers and producers in this process is really important. And finally, monitoring and reporting becomes absolutely critical. I think expectations by the broader kind of forests and commodities community, by the media, by consumers as well, is for increasing levels of transparency and disclosure, and for companies to demonstrate that they're making progress against their commitments. So you've got to monitor and report on progress, both internally and externally, and really make a commitment to transparency and accountability, right? So that that your suppliers see that you mean business, that you're doing what you set out to do, that your customers see that as well. And so that monitoring and reporting piece is crucial. And then it's really kind of a cyclical process of revision and review. So over every 2-3 years, whatever it may be, you need to kind of go back to the beginning and check, right, are we still addressing the problems we've got? Are we, go back to that strategic review process so that there's a continuous cycle of improvement over time. In some more good news, there are heaps of tools and resources that are available to help companies on this journey. So we've included some here on this slide, but I know that you will be receiving some supporting materials following up the webinar, which include more detailed materials and information available for use. What's highlighted here is just a couple of tools that we think are really important. The accountability framework is effectively a framework that helps guide companies in the robust development and implementation of deforestation and conversion-free policies. So that's a great kind of first stop if you are new to this, or if you really want to check that you're doing things in a robust way. Then there are, as mentioned earlier, lots of new technologies that help us with Earth observation, satellite monitoring, kind of real time looking at what's happening on the ground. GFW, or Global Forest Watch, is one of those, and TRACE is another. And what TRACE does is actually look at the flow of commodities and actually links that back to, for example, in Brazil, to the municipality level, to try to really pinpoint what the flow of these commodities looks like. So very useful tool for risk assessment and supply chain mapping. Something that the Tropical Forest Alliance, the organization that I work for, put together and launched just recently is a jurisdictional approaches resource hub. So if you've heard this term, jurisdictional approaches or landscape approaches, if you're not really sure what that is, if you want to see some case studies and examples of how companies are engaging, if you want guidance on actually what companies can do to drive transformation at this scale, it's a really, really useful hub. And ProForest, which is an organization that supports the private sector with the implementation of zero deforestation commitments, also has a lot of great tools on their website. And then the last two, Forest 500 and Supply Chain. This gives you a real flavor of how companies are being assessed for their progress against commitments and for their action on the deforestation agenda. So it's likely that many of you will show up on the Forest 500 kind of being graded for your performance. And I think it gives a sense of what are the elements that the outside world is looking at to see that you're making progress, as well as how you're progressing from the perspective of external stakeholders. So those are just some tools and resources and you'll get some more after the call. Just in closing, and before we turn to our second poll, I just wanted to say that on behalf of the Tropical Forest Alliance, we're absolutely thrilled to see the Fashion Pact committing to action on commodity-driven deforestation. There's a massive opportunity for collaboration with other sectors. The Tropical Forest Alliance was put in place in 2012, or rather in 2015, on the back of the Consumer Goods Forum commitment to zero deforestation, because there is a realization that a multi-stakeholder platform that drives dialogue and collaboration between civil society, government, and the private sector could be really useful in driving this agenda forward. We work primarily with the food, beverage, and personal care sectors, but it's absolutely, I mean, it's just great to see a whole other sector signaling a commitment in such a significant way. And in particular, because what this helps with is sending a really strong signal to producing countries that the markets are really serious, that the demand for sustainable commodities isn't the exception, but it's the norm. And I think the more that we're able to kind of leverage these kinds of commitments and transmit them and send these signals through the market, the more likely we are to really get that sector transformation that we're driving for. And that's possible really only if we work collectively. So thank you all very much for your commitment to this agenda, and TFA stands ready to support the Fashion Pact in any way possible. So with that, let me hand over to Katie for our final poll.
Great, thank you, Petra, and thank you to all of our panelists. That was absolutely fantastic. So I'm gonna go ahead and launch our second poll right before we get into our question and answer section. So this poll is more about letting us understand what might be inhibiting you. So again, 38% of you said that you didn't have a commitment. And a lot of you said you did. So what element do you think might prevent, what might be the most challenging in implementing a commitment? So knowing which supply chains drive deforestation, implementing collective action in a landscape. So again, engaging communities and policy and other stakeholders. Transparency and disclosure, is that something that's worrisome for you as a company? And then leadership engagement. So this is really kind of talking about your internal structure. Do you need more support from your C-level, whether that be directives or resources or involvement? So again, we'll go, or if there's something else, and if you are selecting other, if you could go ahead and type what you think that element would be in the chat box, we can go ahead and collect that, and that will help us figure out where to go next. So I'll give a few more minutes to folks to fill out the poll. Great. So I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll. Looks like we got a few last votes coming in. Great. So again, very, very interesting. We've got another tie, and that's between A and B. So knowing which supply chains are driving deforestation And then, of course, implementing collective action in a landscape with a jurisdictional or maybe a landscape approach. So great, thank you so much. And again, if you did select other, if you want to go ahead and type that into the chat box, we can go ahead and collect that feedback as well. So now we are going to go ahead and launch into the Q&A session of the webinar. And so we've had some questions coming in here at the end. Panelists, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to turn back on your videos. So our first question comes from Katrina. It says, thanks for the great presentation. My question is about animal feed. For many fashion companies, leather is critical material when it comes to deforestation. While brands can decide to prioritize sourcing leather from countries where there is minimal risk of deforestation, understanding the animal feed is trickier. I'm curious to hear how much progress you see in the animal feed industry when it comes to clear labeling around the source of their ingredients. So John, I'm going to go ahead and turn that over to you for our first answer from the panelists.
Sure, thanks, Katie. And it's a great question. You know, I think there has been progress made in that sector. It's also an example of where there are real challenges because feed and ingredients like soy do tend to be a little bit more like palm oil. They're harder to trace, they're more kind of invisible behind the scenes. But there's been a lot of efforts in that regard. It's a great example of what Petra was just talking about as well, the importance of hearing from the market and hearing from different parts of the market and different sectors that there is this demand to eliminate deforestation, to find more sustainable pathways forward for the industry. And so I think I would strongly urge, and Petra, invite you to jump in here as well. But I think it's a great example of where the fashion sector can have an impact and weighing in on the policies that are being developed in the EU and the industry work that's being done. The European Feeds Association has some guidelines and standards that I think there's an open comment period now. So I think it's a great example of an opportunity to weigh in and help kind of push that direction, push that sector in a more positive direction. Petra, do you want to add on that?
Yeah, no, I think this is thanks, John. This is a really great question. And I think it's something, I mean, I would say, yes, some progress has been made, but we hear repeatedly from, for example, retailers that are selling beef in the grocery store that really a problem area is actually the feed sector. And because, as John described, because of how these supply chains operate, those further downstream, whether you're buying leather for a handbag or selling beef in a supermarket, you don't really have direct engagement with the feed manufacturers. And they're sort of in this invisible part, a very impactful but invisible part of the supply chain. They're not the ones that are sort of subject to campaigning NGOs. I don't know how many consumers could even name a manufacturer of animal feed. But I really want to echo what John said. I think this is really an area for cross-sector collaboration, because if the luxury goods sector comes together with and this is an issue where it's like not the most obvious place to collaborate, but where that collaboration can have impact. So yeah, huge room for improvement, and definitely huge room for collaboration with other sectors amongst the Fashion Pact.
Can I just ask you all, and Agathe as well, because on that issue, I thought that there is some policy that's getting put in place on imported deforestation, which is going to make it an imperative for sort of declaring if you are importing a commodity or something that is causing deforestation elsewhere. How are you seeing that sort of playing out on this feed issue?
So Agatha, I don't jump in if you want to, but I know, so the TF, so effectively in July of last year, so July 2019, the European Commission issued a communication on forest protection and imported deforestation. And the EU is now going through a fairly lengthy legislative process to develop new policies. There is nothing immediately in the pipeline. The Commission is working on developing an appropriate regulatory and policy framework for this. What there is, however, is an extremely important opportunity for the private sector to bring your perspectives on what's actually going to be helpful, what's going to work, what are the regulatory frameworks and regulatory instruments that could be helpful. What TFA has done to support this space specifically is brought together over 60 different companies, primarily from, again, food beverage industry, to talk about this, to get their perspectives. We've put together a discussion paper that highlights what we believe are really key messages that the Commission and member states and members of Parliament in the EU need to hear. And so if anyone is interested in sort of supporting this or getting more information, happy to provide that. But yes, I mean, hopefully the EU will shift, but I think we all want it to shift in a way that makes business feasible, makes the execution of supply chains feasible, but supports zero deforestation commitments and doesn't sort of aggravate really existing tensions that we're seeing, you know, in particular in certain countries, in certain producer countries, because that I think will not help sort of the global progress on climate change and deforestation.
And I can try to answer you, Helen, also from Carrefour perspective. Indeed, there's a different regulation in plan, both in France and in Europe. It's not defined yet how it will look precisely, but what I can already say is that I think we need different level of action. We absolutely need companies to look at their own supply chains. And I think some of them are doing that even without regulation, just based on their own responsibility. But then we also need to work on this market-wide approach. And this, to achieve this, we need to go a bit more upstream to our direct suppliers. And this is typically what we can do collectively. Whether there is a regulation or not, actually, we will need this kind of approach. And when there is a regulation, it is possible that it does build on what we will set up as a standard. So this is why we are starting this working group that I mentioned on cattle. We want to really make sure we can align our requests to the upstream actors we sometimes work directly with and sometimes don't work directly with. And setting up these requests so they can see this is the basis now for our to have commercial relationship, whether they're direct or indirect, with some big markets and some big sectors like fashion and retail.
Great, thank you. Okay, Katie, have we got see some other questions coming in?
Yes, so the next one is from Frederico, and this is going to be for you, Helen. It would be very helpful to have a quote-unquote dictionary of materials with high risk correlated with deforestation. This will simplify the supply chain mapping for the companies which do not have biodiversity knowledge on the inside. Is this something that CI could help the Fashion Pact with?
Thanks, good question. Short answer is yes. Longer answer is this is all about this question of materiality assessments in terms of what's material to your business and what's material in terms of biodiversity impact, what materials are material. So absolutely, we're going to be looking at trying to get our heads around prioritizing which materials are linked to biodiversity impact and risk in which geographies. At a sector subsector level or by supply chains, we're still going to figure out if we're going to look at it by different types of material supply chains. Say, well, you know, obviously beef leather has risk from certain parts of the world. The risk is higher, South America, for example, than other parts of the world. For example, New Zealand. It has less risk of deforestation. So while the leather could have a risk in a certain geography, it might not have a risk in another geography. Cellulosics, notably viscose, but any cellulosic that's made from wood pulp might have a different risk in different parts of the world, depending on where it's coming from. So yes, we will try to get into that. I wanted to actually flip that question around a little bit to our experts though, because, and particularly Agathe again, who've had this experience, what we're dealing with is perhaps a suite of 4 or 5 raw materials. You know, we've talked about cellulosics, wood and paper, beef leather, soy for feed potentially, maybe some palm oil and others. When you move into these coalitions for collective action, can you talk about, you can talk about all of those materials together, but at some point, aren't you going to have to focus on action around each of those materials? I mean, how does it work for you, for example, in Carrefour? How do you prioritize which ones you work on?
Well, indeed, we had to do that material assessment. It's a bit like the little walk I took you through in our store to see actually what do we sell and what is connected to forest. So we did work on each of those commodities one by one, I think, in the past. Now, what we're trying to do with the CGF coalition is to make sure for each of those commodities we harmonized how we want to work. We'd also try to have a common view on all those commodities. I'll mention a couple of tools that are really transversal to deal with these commodities. For instance, landscape approach that is now a tool that we understand at local level can be efficient to transform the practices of farmers or of local operators. It cannot be done one commodity one by one. It has to be transversal. And another one is also when we speak to the markets, when we express what we consider as deforestation, and you know, some traders, for instance, they deal with several types of commodities. So I think it's more efficient if we speak to these companies, having a common vision, a collective vision, and transversal vision of what we want to achieve.
Great.
That's an example on what we can do transversally.
Thank you. Perfect. Any other thoughts? Okay, Katie, how are we doing? We've got some other questions coming through.
Some other questions coming through. So this one's from Daniel. It says, thank you for this presentation. In terms of raw material sourcing, I understand all palm oil is negative, for example, but in terms of pulp-based raw materials such as viscose, does sourcing from sustainably managed forests make a difference? Or would eliminating or substituting these kinds of raw materials be more effective in eliminating deforestation? John, do you want to go ahead and take that?
Yes, I'd be happy to take that. Thank you. And I guess I would challenge a notion that all palm oil is negative. It's produced in lots of different ways, and we know there are lots of problems with palm oil if it's not produced well. But we also know there's lots of efforts to produce it better, and there are great examples of that. And so I think this gets to the second part of your question. What I think is really critically important is that companies like those represented on this call stay in the market and stay in the game. And this is what Petra said before, because we desperately need you to be sending the message to the companies and to the governments in producing countries. Send that signal that the market they want these products, but they want them to better. They want them produced better in ways that have better outcomes for the environment and for the communities that live there. And this is why it's really, really important that you are setting standards and enforcing those and helping your suppliers meet those standards. But then you also engage in these collective action type initiatives that we've talked about so many times today. And this is the whole idea. Petra mentioned the jurisdictional approach. And you know, we could have a whole nother webinar on that. We probably should, Helen. But to try and simplify that, I mean, the easiest way to think about that is, you know, you think about your companies. You respond to the market, and when your consumers want something, you know, you will respond to that, and you know, that's how a lot of companies act. When you are setting standards for your suppliers or requesting a certification, you are sending a direct signal to the companies in your supply chain that you want them and need them to adopt better practices. What we also need to do is send a signal to governments that the market and the world wants them to produce better. So one way to think about the jurisdictional approach, I mean, it's a very long-term concept and a long-term play, but this is where we're trying to get to, is to change the whole dynamic and create a race to the top, as opposed to now, as Petra said, there's always a market for stuff. What we're trying to demonstrate is that the jurisdictions, the government regions where governments have a handle on deforestation, have a handle on social challenges, and are making progress in addressing those issues, that those are the ones that are getting more investment, that are getting that the companies operating in those places are more competitive and are doing better. We need to create that investment flow, and that's the whole idea of the jurisdictional approach. Is, you know, if a market-based approach creates incentives for individual companies in the supply chain, jurisdictional approach is the idea that, you know, creates incentives for governments to do better and, again, change that dynamic. And that won't happen if responsible companies walk out of a sector or eliminate palm oil for something else or eliminate viscose for something else. And so really important that, you know, responsible companies stay in and set those standards and engage in this long-term transformation.
Great.
Hope that answered the question.
Yes. I really like that idea that certification sends a message to your supply chain, but a jurisdictional landscape approach sends a message to the government. That's a really nice way of articulating it. Thank you.
And we have some examples where that's starting to play out, and there's been some examples, you know, of you know, governments that are responding to this. And again, those are the ones who want to reward them and show them that there is value in it for them and their constituents.
Great. Any other ones, Katie? I'm so great to have all these questions. This is our first webinar where we've been able to do this. It's really good. Thank you.
Yeah, and one thing I just might add is there's an annex to the slide deck that has some different definitions around jurisdictional approach, as well as some nice visuals if you'd like to learn more about that. And we can certainly explore doing another webinar where we dig deeper into those concepts. So the next question is another question from Frederico. When talking about packaging or viscose, is it enough to look to FSC certifications? Petra, do you want to go ahead and take that one?
Well, I mean, I'll take a stab at it, but I actually would love Helen and John to weigh in on this too. I think there are other considerations. I think certification is a really helpful tool, but it can't exist in isolation. That's something that we've learned over the last decade, that it shouldn't sort of make you feel like you've ticked the box and everything is okay. I think you really need to look at what origins is it coming from. You know, because the certification doesn't solve all the problems that exist in a landscape. And so that would be kind of my short answer is great, really helpful tool, not sufficient on its own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And the only thing I would add is this gets back to the point that Petra was raising as well, is that this is an iterative process. And so FSC is a very important tool. It sends the right signal to the market, but as Petra said, it may not be sufficient. And we know in most cases or many cases, it's not sufficient. And so that's where we need you to engage in these collective action efforts to push for larger transformation. But we also understand you can't do that everywhere, and you can't do that in everything you buy. And so it may be that you focus on a wider range of certifications to send that market signal, and then you do the deeper dive of what are the highest priority, the highest risk, the most material for you, what's important to you and what are you important to from a market perspective. And those may be the places and should be the places where you dive deeper into supporting these broader transformational objectives. So, I mean, one way to think about it is it's kind of a broad and a deep strategy.
Yeah, and I think the certification is very much about what a single company action could do to send a message. It's about, that is a really important first step. And on FSC, it's choose the right FSC, choose the strongest and the best. There are three different FSC certifications. So choose the strongest and the best. Doesn't necessarily capture all the biodiversity pieces that we want, but it does capture a lot of the forest-based issues that we want, deforestation, namely, stopping that. And that's a great company action, but as we've been talking about, there's that other more collective action approach that goes beyond. So it's certainly do it.
And not necessarily, it's not an either or, it's a both, but recognizing you can't do both everywhere. And so that's where that company specific prioritization is going to be really important. But it's very complementary approaches, and both are important.
And I think that's actually that sort of theme around the collective action, is that certification is something that really effectively is done at an individual company level. And I know, you know, for sure some of this other engagement we're describing may seem daunting, but that's really the beauty of working together, because you're not in it alone. And so not only do you have the collective voice, you've got the collective resource, you've got the collective leverage and the collective learning. So that's why working together is just so much more likely to increase impact.
Great, thank you. And then we've got one last question that's actually I can take. And the question is, will we get the slide deck after the call to share with our colleagues? And yes, you'll be getting the slide deck, the recording, as well as a supplemental materials package, which includes the links to the tools Petra mentioned, as well as some recent articles. So for example, the one on the fashion industry's role in deforestation from Global Canopy, as well as some other reports. So that is the last question that we have. Again, if you have any more, feel free to send them to fashion@conservation.org, and we're happy to follow with you up afterwards. But now I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Helen, who's going to tell us what's next.
Right. Well, first I'm going to say big thank you to our expert panel. They were so articulate and succinct and brilliant. All three of you, thank you so much. It is a big, gnarly topic, a big, crazy, complex topic, and you really honed in on the key issues that we need to be thinking about. And we will probably have you all back. Well, Agathe, we will certainly have you as our expert in the Fashion Pact. But as we continue the journey in the next 2 years on this biodiversity pillar, we are going to need to have more of these discussions and more of the guidance from experts like you. So thank you so much for your time and effort and really sharing that knowledge and wisdom with us. So you're free. Thank you. We'll be in touch about the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Just a couple of points. I mean, I think that question and answer session was really fruitful and really interesting, and it highlighted some takeaways. I just wanted to leave you with 4 key takeaways. I mean, obviously the first one is the imperative that we have in the next less than a decade now to really shift action around for climate and nature, and forests are an absolute key lever in making the change we need for a more climate friendly, nature positive, thriving society and economy that we need to start heading towards in the next decade. And so forests are absolutely key, and the way we look out for forests and protect and restore them is going to be essential, and we need to move rapidly and nimbly, which gets to my second point, is we have got a lot of great knowledge and tools and experience to build on. So we're in a really great position. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to reinvent anything, really. We just have to come together. And that brings me to my next point, is that this collective action, which came up over and over again, which Fashion Pact is really beautifully positioned to sort of come together and join other coalitions and act together. But it does also, I did want to highlight my fourth point, is that while we talked about in the question and answer, it's not just about the collective action of what we all do together. There is individual action that companies can do. We talked about that vis-a-vis the certification and so on, and that how you can clean up, identify your own supply chains and clean up your own supply chains. But the important thing here about where we are in the world with the nature crisis and the climate crisis is that cleaning up your own supply chain isn't going to be enough. We need to be actors and levers of change for a bigger transformation. And that's what the Fashion Pact is about. It's about cleaning up our supply chains, making them better, making them nature positive and so on. But it's also about that transformation agenda. It's also how do we make change happen at a bigger scale. And when we come back to science-based targets, which we'll all be working through in the coming months as part of your biodiversity strategies, there is a piece of the science-based targets. It is about what you do in your supply chain as an individual company, but also then what are you doing as a company to contribute to transformational change. So a lot of what we've been talking today about the forests and the action around forests will fit into these buckets of what you're doing under science-based targets as a company in your supply chain, but also beyond, to help transform, make real change happen and transform this currently crazy forest loss scenario that we're dealing with into something that is halting deforestation, into a world where we protect and restore forests. So this will all start aligning. You'll see there's a magic to all this that you'll start seeing. There'll be a coherence with the way we will tackle biodiversity in the coming months, that we'll start seeing the links on all that we do. And that brings me to the next step. So what's next is we, of course, are going to continue helping and supporting you as you think through your biodiversity work and your commitments. And one of the next things we're working on is a blueprint. The blueprint is for a strategy. So you've committed to creating biodiversity strategies at a company level. And what we're going to do is create a sort of a blueprint, which is a blueprint, which is like a template, an outline that talks about what would go into a biodiversity strategy and how you would actually do it, sort of the process and what the structure of a strategy would look like. It's going to be quite a simple framing, but that will then help you understand. That'll be sort of like your recipe book or your guidebook to what we're going to do in the next year, because we're going to be following those steps to fill out take that blueprint and turn it into a strategy. So in the coming month, we will have a webinar and an introduction on that biodiversity blueprint. And I think that, and we will be in touch, of course, about what's happening in early 2021 and how we move forward on our program of work. I think that's all I have for you at this moment. Again, thank you so much for spending so much of your time with us. I hope this was informative. We enjoy presenting this to you, and I hope you enjoy it. Katie can follow up with what you need. A big congratulations to all of you on your annual report that was launched, was it just last week? Copenhagen Fashion Summit. Thank you again for your engagement in this incredibly important topic. Be safe, be well, and stay tuned for the next topic in the next session on biodiversity and the nature of fashion. Thank you. Bye-bye.